in the context of Colorado, it is fair to say that dimethyltryptamine, ibogaine, mescaline, not including peyote, psilocybin, and psilocin have been legalized for adults 21 and over to use, possess, cultivate, transport, transfer, gift, share.
Welcome to Psilocybin Says, everyone. The voice you're hearing is Connor. I edit these episodes, and I'm happy to now be voicing some intros as well. You know, we as humans suffer for want of what is beheld clearly by the mushroomed mind. So it's been a pleasure and a privilege to help produce this show because it is resonant with my desire to see mushrooms happen to the world. Okay, today's episode features Kevin Matthews. Matthews is a seasoned political strategist and drug policy reform advocate in Denver, Colorado. In 2018, he formed Decriminalize Denver, a grassroots effort that successfully passed Initiative 301 in May 2019, making Denver the first city in the United States to effectively decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms. As a political speaker and advocate for psychedelics, he is committed to educating the public and being a steward of the psychedelic renaissance. Here's a question for you to keep in mind during the conversation. How important is it to you that your city or state achieve the freedom Denver and others have achieved? Connecting with local decrim initiatives on social media will show you ways you can contribute. And if you're new here, you can subscribe on YouTube and podcasts, and make sure you connect with us on Instagram and TikTok. And now, Eric and Courtney interview Kevin Matthews.
All right, Kevin Matthews, the man, the myth, the legend. I've been looking forward to this conversation for really years, but just a few weeks since we last spoke. So thank you so much for joining us on Psilocybin Says.
Yeah, it's great to have you here.
Absolutely, Courtney and Eric. Yeah, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this one.
I feel like most people have an idea of who you are, but I may be overestimating my intimate knowledge of the world of psilocybin. So you have been, I've been watching your work for years. I was so impressed in how you led that Decrim Denver, which was the first psilocybin decriminalization in the nation. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, Denver was
incredible.
The first city to deprioritize psilocybin mushrooms, personal use, possession, and cultivation. And what was unique about Denver is that we basically told the city not to spend any city funds on enforcement as well. So it was kind of a step in a new direction with decriminalization.
What a milestone for the mushroom here in the United States. So, but before we get into your professional career, your professional involvement with psilocybin, why don't you kind of tell our listeners how you came into the world of psilocybin and some of the impact that it's had on your personal life?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the journey with this for me goes back to over a decade when I left the U.S. military academy. So when I was a really, really little kid, when I was 9 years old, I was like, I'm going to go be in the Army. And then my dad said, well, you're smart enough to be an officer. And if you want to be an officer in the military, then you should go to one of the service academies. And so from a very young age, I wanted to go to either West Point, which is the U.S. military academy up in New York, or the U.S. Naval Academy, which is in Annapolis, Maryland. And, ended up getting into West Point. I was there for 2.5 years. But when I was there, I was diagnosed with major depression and ended up leaving, getting a medical discharge. I'm actually retired from the U.S. Army because of a 30% disability with major depression. And my entire life, I wanted to serve my country as a U.S. military officer. And when I left West Point, my sense of self essentially crumbled. My identity completely disappeared. So I was kind of lost in a sea of uncertainty about who I am, what I want to do with my life, while at the same time struggling with depression. And as a result of that, it led me down the path of, I'm sure many folks might have this experience, but just devouring self-help books, learning a lot about human psychology, trying to get to the root of kind of what's going on in my life and how to, how to get better. And that led me down the path of learning a lot about spirituality and different traditions. And went to yoga school, and eventually that also led me to wanting to learn more about psychedelic plants and fungi, our plant medicine allies and friends. And my experience, the breakthrough experience that I had with psilocybin was 11 years ago, just this last January. And it was here in Denver. And I was with a new group of friends and kind of embraced a new lifestyle from a much more kind of transformational perspective, maybe a little bit new agey in some cases, but we have a tremendous community here in Colorado. And that experience changed my life. We went for a walk. It was in the city. We went to a park. And I remember just looking up at the sky, and whether the clouds actually parted or not, this insight came to me that said, Kev, like, how the mushrooms speak to us, right? Like, Kev, you no longer have to be a victim to your diagnosis. You can make the choice. You can change your mind and start to walk a different path, and make those small concerted steps in a new direction every single day. And that was the moment that really catalyzed this shift for me and a lot of changes in my life. And a few years later, I learned about the work that MAPS was doing with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, veterans and other populations, which really piqued my interest in learning more about the science of these medicines, the modern science, right? All the clinical research. And fast forward another few years later, I'm a father. I have an 8.5-year-old. I think my little guy was about 2 or 3 at the time, 2017. So yeah, he would have been just over 3 years old. It was actually a podcast where Joe Rogan was interviewing Paul Stamets. And it was the first one he did, I think, with Paul. It was, I want to say November 2017. And in that interview, if folks haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it because it's just packed with information coming from, the grand wizard himself, Paul. He shares about his first experience with psilocybin. And then something he said, which just stuck with me in a very profound way. He basically said, Joe, congratulations, you're now a vector of Paul Stamets. And he said that because Paul was referring to the fungal microbiome that exists in our bodies and how we're constantly breathing in and breathing out spores, right? And like when he said that, it was just a moment of clarity. To me, it was like a total scientific basis and rationale for the fact that we are all connected. We do exist in this beautiful unity together that might look different. But we're all riding this, this spaceship Earth together, right? And also in that interview, excuse me, they briefly discussed a campaign which was happening in California at the time. And so that in that campaign, if I remember correctly, was called the California Psilocybin Legalization Initiative.
Oh yeah,
and
I talked to that guy. Yeah, I forgot. Yeah.
Kevin. I forget Kevin's last name.
Yeah.
And so that kind of dropped the spore and the spark inside of me of like, man, it'd be great if we did something like that here in Colorado. And then, sure enough, a few weeks later, I got basically scrolling through the news feed, and there were some folks who were organizing. And so I jumped on that as quickly as possible. I was like, man, this is a sign. And so, the original work here in Denver was initially spearheaded by another individual. His name is Tyler. And he and I just hit it off. And kind of one thing led to another after multiple iterations of different kind of drafting of ballot language for the city and county of Denver, where folks asked me to spearhead the campaign. And I did. And although I was the campaign manager, I mean, that was an incredible effort because most of us had no experience, myself included, with any kind of advocacy or activism or policy reform work. We were learning as we were going, and we were bootstrapped. And that was an effort, a community effort of leadership in so many ways. So many of us wore a ton of different hats, and knowing that we needed to, in many ways, because this was, this work is so new for people, we had to rebrand the image of psilocybin mushrooms away from the stigma right, from the 60s and 70s. And I think with my training and skills coming from the military, being educated in a very formal way at West Point, that made me a good candidate to kind of be the front person and in the press and doing all that stuff with Denver's campaign. And before we get, there's much more I can share about Denver, but that's how, that's the Reader's Digest version of how I came to this work.
Beautiful.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I'm so curious about that whole process. It's something that we talk about here. And I just want to say that that's one of the things that I noticed back then is how great of a job you all did at branding of the mushroom. One of the things that I'm remembering about the guy in California, I don't think he's still involved in psilocybin work, but he did an interview where he started talking about aliens, with the New York Times or something. And while I'm fully on board with the possibilities of psilocybin allowing us to communicate with extraterrestrial life, I'm not sure that's what needs to go on the front page. So I was super impressed with how you all presented it. And I think that had to have such a massive impact to it becoming accepted like it was.
Yeah. It really did. We heavily lean on the science. And then really our messaging was that no single person deserves to face, severe criminal penalties for using something that, one, grows naturally. It's a gift from God on this planet, that it's our human birthright to use these medicines. And then two, looking at the safety, as you both well know, of course there's risks, but the safety and the efficacy of these medicines, and it worked. And I'll never forget. I'm learning to actually say that differently. I will always remember the moment, May 8th, 2019. Election day was May 7th. And it was so close the entire evening. I think by 1 a.m. on election night, and folks have left our watch party, and which is our election night event, which was so much fun. Folks were kind of downtrodden because we were behind. We were losing. Every hour and a half they updated the election results, and it was like, no and yes, inching closer and closer and closer and closer. And when I went to sleep that evening after, it was late at night, I learned that we had 40,000 more votes to count. And it was the largest turnout election in Denver's history in 30 years.
Wow.
And so they announced the results on May 8th. And I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it right now. They announced the results on May 8th at 4:20 p.m. on the dot.
Wow.
And I'm in my driveway on the phone, and I get a text message or something, a phone call, and it was a journalist buddy of mine, and he was like, I picked it up. I got off one call, picked that one up, and he's like, Kevin, you won. And so I was like, hit end, refreshed the feed on the election tracker, and sure enough, they declared it. And I just did this like primal, release into the cosmos and deeply rooted in my house, like, because all this energy and time and uncertainty from the pretty much like 18 months of work with that campaign as well culminated in that moment, which just opened up so many tremendous possibilities, I think not just for Denver, but, so many other people to do this work. And
absolutely.
That's what I'm thinking right now is just like, I'm so grateful that you listened to the calling, or however you want to put it, to pursue this very new thing for you of advocacy work. I'm so grateful because it's helping us. It's helping all the other people that are standing up for our birthright to practice.
Well, that's what we saw. How many cities are we at now that have done decriminalization efforts?
I want to say 17.
Okay.
Mostly spearheaded. It's right. And to give full credit, mostly spearheaded by the nationwide advocacy network of Decriminalize Nature. Right. I mean, Oakland happened 6 weeks after Denver, and now we're at 17 cities and, 2 states, Oregon and Colorado. And then, this session at state legislatures across the entire country, over a dozen states are considering some kind of reform. I mean, this No, and I'll just be clear. I know you guys know this. Like, I do the best that I can to be a conduit for this because, you know, the medicine, the mushrooms are really directing the conversation here. They're directing the movement. You know, there's so many parallels with what's happening in the world right now. And I think why, you know, these medicines are really coming to the surface and becoming more available for people at this time because we need their wisdom. Yeah.
Well, before we get into the consciousness of mushrooms, which definitely want to, can you talk a little bit about like that 2-year window? Because it's been 2 years since the decrim, and then or 3 years now. Is it 4 years? Where the fuck are we? Is it 4 years now?
It'll be 4 years in May.
Yeah, 4 years.
Yep.
And so now Colorado has legalized, which is a massive step. What I'm seeing so far and the conversations that we had, you know, it's like, seems like Colorado is really on the right track. And so, you know, it might be helpful to do some kind of comparison between the situation in Colorado, the situation in Oregon, because as states start to open up, we're going to have various models, and for people to understand, you know, as big a picture as they can of what's going on, is really important, I think.
Sure. Sure. Well, you know, I don't think there's any one size fits all cookie cutter regulatory solution here. Different states are going to look different based on the demographics there, people's opinions, et cetera. Right. Different regulatory systems. I think so much of this work is around education, and we have a ton more of that to do. And thankfully, you know, we have the success across the country in all these different states. We have Oregon, we have Colorado, we have models that we know work, or at least we hope work, because we're going to see as Oregon's service centers with psilocybin come online anytime now. And as we go through our rulemaking and regulatory process here, you know, we're going to find out how effective these models can be and how they can be iterated in some way in other places. What I do know for a fact is that decriminalization works. You know, decriminalization first needs to be a priority here. And because in many ways that liberates people's ability to use these medicines in a way that works for them and in community. And so models of community healing that can be created through decrim efforts are critical. And then if we look at access, you know, a lot of these self-regulating communities, which is kind of how I like to talk about them now, you know, of folks who've been using these medicines and who are using these medicines, in many ways, those communities aren't necessarily accessible. I think in the way that perhaps we need to address a lot of the crises that we're facing in our country right now. And so, you know, just to use Colorado as an example, what I love about our measure is that it really is, to me, is the best of both worlds, because it has this regulated therapeutic access program that's going to be available, you know, where people 21 and over can access or be offered, you know, facilitation of these services at state licensed locations, healing centers, approved healthcare locations, et cetera. But we also have the removal of criminal penalties, and essentially it's a true form of decriminalization, where adults 21 and over can use, possess, cultivate at home, and gift or share these medicines with their community, their friends, their family members if they're 21 and over. And it creates a possibility for folks to continue actually working and creating these different containers of healing and transformational work outside of the regulated model. And so I think, and circling back to education, a lot of these states right now that are looking at legislation, a lot of them are research bills. I think in many places, you know, Colorado is unique. We kind of spearhead a lot of things, at least in drug policy, and especially, you know, obviously cannabis and plant medicines now. And, you know, we just have to consider that. I mean, it's important to consider that people have different perspectives about these medicines, right? Like we had paid opposition here in Colorado, folks who basically collapsed psilocybin into the same category as both cannabis and fentanyl, which was actually not very surprising. And that's unfortunate, though, because it's just simply a matter of how are we talking about these medicines in a way that makes sense for people. And then, having the data, having the science, but more importantly, getting that, passionate voice of conviction from someone who's been healed by this to really give that personal, emotional touch along with the data, right? And we need both of those things. And so, I'm very optimistic. I'm really proud of this work that's happened, obviously here in Colorado and across the country. And in many ways, the way that I kind of think about this, especially in my work now, is that this is really a big ship with a small rudder, and plant medicines can be, it's a different form of energy that we can use to maybe just turn that ship 1 or 2 degrees so that ultimately we're at this different destination. But that small rudder, it takes a lot of turning of the wheel to get there. Mm-hmm. And, there's so many other healing modalities and work that can be, holistically integrated with this medicine work as well. It's not just about psychedelics, right? Like it's the full spectrum of, how these medicines inspire, inspire a catalyze a shift in a person's life in a way where they're living more connected, in spirit with their divine spark within them, firmly rooted here on the ground, and like making these lifestyle changes and new choices. So there's a lot there.
For sure.
Yeah. I'm thinking right now about, so with Sanctuary, part of our membership process is the last part is a discovery call with other new members. And that's an opportunity for people to ask questions, any questions that they have, which there's generally a lot. And we have people all over the country. And the call last week, we had 2 new members from Colorado, and they both mentioned, we're so excited that psilocybin is now legal in Colorado. And of course, whenever someone says legal versus decriminalized, I feel the need to have an education moment about the difference between the two. And there's we get this a lot, that people don't understand the difference. And you mentioned, as you were speaking just now, some of the things that come along with decriminalization, but just to have that 101 education moment, would you mind telling our listeners the difference between decriminalization and legalization?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Awesome. And it's actually a really important question. So first of all, let's look at Denver. In Denver, we didn't decriminalize mushrooms. We deprioritized them. And the press, it's always in the press, it's been decriminalized or even legalize in the context of Prop 122. But in Denver, we deprioritized, and that's actually what's happened in the cities across the country. Their entheogens are the lowest enforcement priority for police and law enforcement, really meaning that like jaywalking is a higher offense. So at the city level where these medicines have been deprioritized, and I'm going to keep saying deprioritized, I know it's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's the correct term to use here. Folks have to consider that in those cities, in whichever state where those cities are, it's still illegal at the state level, and it's also illegal at the federal level, right? So, and if we look at kind of traditional models of decriminalization, they're typically a reduction in penalties, where something goes from being a felony for possession, let's say, to being a misdemeanor. So Oregon's Measure 110 is actually a good example, which was passed in 2020 alongside Measure 109, which was their psilocybin services initiative. Measure 110 decriminalized the personal use of all drugs in small amounts, and folks who were in possession of those drugs over those approved amounts do have to face some kind of civil penalty, but it's not a criminal penalty any longer. So they're not really facing incarceration or heavy fines or fees or jail time. So to back up, because I'm talking a lot here. Decriminalization typically, historically, involves a reduction in penalties. The beautiful thing about the work that we're doing with plant medicine is that in none of the cities across the country, and including here in Colorado statewide, there's first of all no possession limits. For example, a person can have any amount on their person, in their pocket, in their car, and that's the same in, like I said, in all the cities. Denver, there's no limit on possession, so it goes a little bit step further, which is why I think that, and some of the news outlets actually have a really good argument here. Where I actually had a conversation with one of the journalists who was writing a story for Proposition 122, where he kept using the term legalize. And I asked him, like, why are you saying legalize here? And he said, well, as I've been saying, decriminalization typically includes some kind of reduction in penalty and a fine. But what you're doing in Colorado is that there's no fines, no limits on possession. You're removing criminal penalties completely for the possession and use of these medicines. To me, that's legalization. And so I think in the context of Colorado, it is fair to say that dimethyltryptamine, ibogaine, mescaline, not including peyote, psilocybin, and psilocin have been legalized for adults 21 and over to use, possess, cultivate, transport, transfer, gift, share. There are guardrails. Folks can share an amount that's necessary with others in the context of community healing and supportive services, guidance, harm reduction services, religious use, etc. So that's, yeah. So I hope that makes sense, because that was a lot. Does that make sense?
That's great. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
It is much more complicated than it seems on the surface level.
Yeah, it's something that, as we live in, as Eric mentioned when we first started, we live in this psychedelic bubble sometimes and really take for granted how much we have been immersed in all this information. But as you said, there's still so much more education to do for the general population. So,
and I'm learning how to really tighten it up.
Yeah,
because learning so much about policy reform, I feel like just this vast wealth of, and I have to get everything out there, but I can keep it a little bit shorter for sure.
Yeah,
with the policy.
I know what you mean.
I particularly love this ability to gift mushrooms. That seems like such an essential and powerful part of this, and we were relatively involved in at least the attempts to bring in some religious protection under Oregon, and I think that was one of the biggest disappointments to me, is that they, you have to charge for psilocybin. And, we pick a lot of wild psilocybin here that I would never try to make money. We gift all of our mushrooms to our members anyway. That's part of who we are as a community, And so to take that away it just doesn't make sense to me. But can I ask a question about the religious communities in Oregon? Because so a lot of people come to us thinking that sanctuary and psychedelic churches are just a way of trying to be a workaround, right? That we just want to create a loophole. I believe that the spiritual access or religious organizations, however you want to term this, that we're comfortable with, is truly the future of psychedelics long term. Because even as research tells us over and over, it's the mystical experience that, really elicits the long-term healing. So they are mystical in nature. And I'm just wondering, in Colorado, where you have kind of much more access, much more freedom to practice, are we already seeing, because this seems like the little petri dish, the best little, petri dish of psilocybin that we have right now, are we seeing an expansion of religious communities, or is it moving more towards therapeutic communities, or is it more towards private and home practices? What's the trending that you're seeing out there?
All of the above.
Okay.
All of the above. There are a number of churches that are emerging here in Colorado, and they're using that 508(1)(a), or I forget
C1A.
the IRS, 508(c)(1)(a), right? So, and creating, containers for this work from that religious use perspective. The people are writing doctrines. So we certainly are seeing more church organizations emerging. And as you both also well know, like this work has been happening underground for such a long time. There are communities of work where they may not, it's not a church per se, but maybe they meet a couple times a month and get together as friends and family to have a ceremony together. I'm totally having a deja vu right now. That's awesome. Yeah, right. That's kind of threw me off for a second. I was like, whoa, that's
doing something good then.
Totally. Yeah. It's we're on the right path here.
Yeah.
Well, when I saw you coming up with the decrim, I was like, I know that guy. I know that guy from I don't know, Maya land or something. Were we in this together before? So anyway,
we might have been. Yeah, seriously. I recently sat with a new good friend who facilitated a psychic reading for me, and she was like, "You've been here like 584 times." I was like, "Okay, I can feel that. I've done a lot of work, it seems like, in this lifetime too, and it's like bringing it all together now, potentially, right?" So,
did they tell you this was your last Earth incarnation? Because that's
no,
what I was told. I was told through someone else who asked a psychic about me that this was my last incarnation on this earth, and I would be moving to another planet.
Congratulations!
That's beautiful.
I hope I go too. With you.
Yeah, let's go together, please.
Yeah, together.
Oh my goodness.
So anyway, just the on the ground, what it's looking like out there. It's so curious.
Yeah. Right. So okay. So what's really cool about the way that we pass this measure with this kind of 18-month window, it's now about 17-month window before the regulations come down, is that, we have the possibility for this emergence of, different communities to start getting to work, continuing to work in their communities, but in a much more possibly dynamic, maybe a little bit more official way. And my hope is that all the communities across the state who are already engaging in this work and now doing so under the context of Prop 122, where they're protected, can really create good models for our state legislature and for the regulatory body to consider, and for the advisory board that we have, to consider all these different community models that are fruiting bodies here in the state as they create their regulations. And we got to protect these civil liberties and human rights that were just passed by 1.3 million voters in the state of Colorado. I said recently that voters here recently took a hero's dose together. That might be a little bit, maybe a micro dose, but I mean, we all said yes to this, right? Filling in that bubble that says yes, I'm sure was exciting for a lot of people. It sure was for me. As on election night, I was racing to get my ballot to turn it in.
Oh God, there's people around the country watching them. People around the world are watching this thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like from on the ground, knowing that the medicine is here, it's in community already. And it's been here, right? I mean, for 70 years now, since CSA. Yeah. I mean, people have been working with this stuff for a long time. And now that we have the chance where there's liberation, and like, I keep getting goosebumps because it always just fascinates me. Well, like people just feel safe talking about this now. And like to be able to recommend somebody, over a text message and not Signal or some other encrypted app, and to be open about our communication here. And it's important to be tactful and mindful, right? But the fact that we can even just have public discourse now in a much more a much more open way is so fascinating and tremendous. And I hope that discourse and the fact that more people are engaging with, in this work will have an influence on what the rules look like in 2024 when they come down. And we have, again, lots of education to do. Because now the whole playing field has changed, right? Like from the campaign, and there were, different folks that we were talking to. Now we're talking to state lawmakers, county commissioners, local elected officials, city council, et cetera, businesses, state agencies. It's a whole new next phase of this conversation, kind of as we're continuing to build our coalition across the state here to support this implementation. And, knowing that we have so many people who are so deeply rooted and connected with this medicine, it's important to me that as much as possible that they're involved, in this rulemaking process the next 17 months.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess that brings up the question for me, and like, how much could it change?
Which part?
Well, just like the gifting of sacrament or the gifting of mushrooms, in-home personal use. I mean, the home cultivation seems like a really important part. When Oregon brought in the no wild mushrooms, I was like livid, because that's like nature's finest, in my opinion. So, yeah, I mean, do you have any kind of a read on it? I mean, still a ways out, obviously. But
sure.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, okay, getting back into policy talk, and I'm going to keep this concise. This part concise. So our measure, Proposition 122 is what's known as a statutory measure. And there's also a constitutional measure, which requires a little bit more of a popular vote to make it a constitutional amendment to the state's constitution. Prop 122 being a statutory measure, that means that our state lawmakers, so state senators and state representatives, do have the power to amend Prop 122 in some way. Mm-hmm. What we know right now is that, first of all, DORA. So DORA is the Department of Regulatory Agencies. That's the state agency that is overseeing the Regulated Natural Medicine Access Program, and has oversight there. They were just recently quoted in an article here locally describing how they have no idea what they're doing with natural medicine, which is
good
fair.
For them for being honest.
For being honest, right?
Yeah.
And, I mean, goodness, we dropped this. When voters said yes to this, we have this incredible 18-page ballot measure, and it's just like, here you go. Hey, have fun.
Right.
Figure this out.
Figure that out. Yeah.
This is new. It's a new regulatory framework, right? And so they're asking for help, right? So I think like what we know right now, there's two things. We know that two state lawmakers are working together on enabling legislation. Enabling legislation is basically a piece of legislation that's written by lawmakers that essentially initiates the process of integrating Proposition 122 into the state's regulatory infrastructure. So they've, from what I understand, they're figuring out how to make this work. They also have concerns around personal use. And it's been a hot topic in our community recently because people are concerned that state lawmakers are going to potentially recriminalize the possession of natural medicines. Now, these lawmakers have said publicly that they don't want to do that. And they want to have whatever legislation is introduced, have that legislation embody the spirit of the measure. Nothing's been written right now. They are drafting something. And I believe it's what we need to do is be ready to organize. And while we are organizing, and we need to be ready to have, as I mentioned before, individuals with strong, compelling stories to go to our state legislature and testify and share about their experience with these medicines, and just like really, emphatically say these are our natural right to use these, for healing, for transformational purposes. So, we will wait and see what the bill ends up saying as it's written.
Okay.
And I know they're considering other things too, like how, should other state agencies get involved? How is this thing going to be, how can we potentially, split the burden of work between different state agencies? And that reminds me, to me, from my perspective, the burden of proof is on our lawmakers to provide compelling evidence that clearly shows that adding additional limits to the personal use of natural medicines creates a clear risk to public health and safety. They have to prove that, because all of the data that we have says otherwise.
Right.
And my hope is that, currently at this time that at least in terms of limits, because I totally support, like, how are we better integrating Proposition 122 into the state's regulatory infrastructure at the state level and the local level. At the same time, my request is like, hey, let's wait a little bit. Let's collect some data. Let's look at enforcement data. Lawmakers are concerned about, massive distribution and, pounds of mushrooms going out of state. There may not necessarily be any evidence for that to be the case. So what I am excited about kind of in this whole process as I'm navigating it is, like, we get to have a really powerful dialogue, with our lawmakers here, in a way that's rational and pragmatic and respectful and professional. And I think at the end of the day, if we can, bring some of these faces forward of people who've had, tremendous healing experiences with this medicine, and then combining that with this data, I think we'll be successful. And then, just to kind of close the loop here, in terms of the regulated access program. So DORA, which is the agency I mentioned, their only oversight is for the therapeutic access, not for personal use.
Okay.
Lawmakers can, as I mentioned, certainly make amendments as they feel necessary, but all of that has to go through the whole process at the state capitol.
Okay. So big question for me in all of this. Obviously, this is just your opinion right now. But facilitators experience, can Colorado please make it such that facilitators must have more than one mushroom trip under their belt before they are a service provider? That's my opinion. You may differ. Curious what your thoughts are on that. But it just seems like when we talk about public safety, the fact that this is not brought into the conversation blows my mind. Like, it was brought into the conversation, but it was just as easily dismissed, in the talks up in Oregon. And like, I just personally don't think that there's anything that is more important to safety with psilocybin than having the sitters be highly or moderately, at minimum, experienced with the medicine itself. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you. If it were a perfect world, I would say that facilitators, a part of their training is an experiential. We know that I have a lot of folks that I know who are in the ketamine assisted psychotherapy space, who are doing training in that regard. And a part of their training is that experiential, basically, week with their students. My hope is that, yes, that would be part of one of the requirements to be a facilitator. I can see a situation where, on the other hand, a person might have deep personal experience with other forms of consciousness expanding modalities. And where that person may also be qualified to, get licensed as a facilitator after they go through a training. But I agree. I think part of the training program should be, if people are going to administer these medicines in a regulated, licensed setting, and they have a license and they're, a trained facilitator, then they should have experience directly with this medicine. And, it's interesting, Eric, I've never heard it actually, when you said in terms of safety, can you unpack that a little bit? Because I'm really curious about that from a safety perspective of folks having experience with this if they're facilitating.
Absolutely. I mean, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of instances that come to mind for me as a facilitator of deep trauma healing. The one that is most pronounced, easiest for me to share right now, is working with a 30-something-year-old man who was just certain he had lost his mind, certain he was in some nightmare hellscape, right? And he was never going to get out. And he told me afterwards that the only thing, and there were multiple facilitators there, and he was just like, the only person he would even be with was me. And he told me afterwards that the reason is because he knew that I had been there. He knew when I looked in his eyes and told him, and he asked me, has this ever happened to you? And I looked in his eyes and I said, I've been there. You're going to get through this, and I'm going to be with you until you do. That I know played such a crucial role. And he wasn't, I mean, it was a long, challenging night after that, but him knowing that, I know, and there's another guy I worked with, this young boxer, right, who had been raped by, he'd been gang raped by several men. And during his trip at the very outset, he started to feel like, oh my God, I've put myself in another scenario. He's reliving his trauma. I'm in this place with unfamiliar people. I'm getting ready to be attacked or whatever. And he, to be able to exude that, knowing that I understand that you are terrified and I understand that you feel like you're not going to get out of this. And I want you to know that you are, and you are safe. And there's just, there's so little that we know as a culture about working with these medicines that have been removed from our cultural experience for so long. And they require so much exposure because it can be so confusing, and you forget so much of it after it's gone. And so it takes so many approaches before you really truly gain that knowing. And then the fact that this is so much of an energetic experience and so much of what we communicate to people. And I have also worked with therapists who were anxious or worried about the people they were working with. And those individuals came to me and said, thank God you were there, because your therapist was terrified of me, and I could tell that. And the only reason that I was able to kind of stay centered and feel safe is because you were smiling at me while she was, like sweating over there in the corner. So there, this work it requires attention to so many subtleties and so much nuance and so much unspoken communication. And I just don't think that we have the background as a culture to understand that. And so those who do have that real deep, rich level of experience, I feel like it is our place to, be at the table in these conversations so that we can keep everybody safe. That's absolutely what it's all about. I'm not trying to peer pressure. I've had people accuse me of trying to peer pressure them into taking mushrooms, because if you're going to be a facilitator for me, you're going to take mushrooms, period. And I'm not going to force it on you, but we're going to schedule this, and this is going to be part of your training protocol because I want to keep everybody safe. Anyway,
well, that's so powerful, right? Because if we look at how these medicines have been used traditionally and how people apprentice under, under medicine holders, part of that apprenticeship is working directly with the medicine and having that deep personal experience and having those challenging moments as well, and learning how to navigate that space. For me personally, you're anybody that I work with in this space, who's sitting for me, I want them to have more experience than I do. And so I'm right there with you. I can't speak to how that's going to, whether or not that'll be the case here in Colorado, but I certainly hope so. And I think the opportunity that we have with that is that with our Natural Medicine Advisory Board, I hope they really invite this kind of a conversation with people in our community who aren't a part of that official board that's making recommendations to the agency. So I really hope that, my hope is that we have this really tremendous opportunity of convergence for a lot of different interests in this space. And that especially that, the decision makers and the policymakers are taking the time to, listen to members of our community, like both of you, and folks, like you who are here in Colorado who have this connection and want to see. That's a strong argument from a safety perspective. To have deep experience with this and to know how to guide a person, into a more fruitful outcome, because it's so easy to my own personal experience, it's so easy to get lost in there when it gets hard.
For sure.
For sure. And so, yeah, so, we'll see. And again, the opportunity for a lot of advocacy here in the state to reach and connect with and educate, these individuals who are making these decisions.
So, even more broadly, what are your thoughts, or how do you, your perspective on, that it seems like psilocybin and other plant medicines like mescaline and whatnot, psychedelic plant medicines are being treated like and compared to Western modalities, right? Like your fentanyl or your Tylenol or whatever it is, right? And these are so very different. So I'm just curious on how to frame that conversation so that people, like most legislators, are not going to have the experience. How do we contextualize this so that they understand that, this is not a typical Western medicine?
First and foremost, bringing in that indigenous perspective, members of, folks who were in indigenous community, who've been working with these medicines, whether here in the States or, in other parts of the world, to really bring that perspective in from a traditional use and talking about how, if we're referring to these as medicines, then as distinct from, your SSRIs or even over-the-counter stuff, I think it's helpful for people to know that there's actually a process here. You're not just popping a pill, right, and your symptoms go away. And that's why I love doing this work, and frankly, why it can be so challenging sometimes, because it is a process-oriented thing, right? It's I actually love a new friend kind of framed it in a way for me where he said, basically, working with these medicines is 10% preparation, 20% the experience, and then 70% integration, right? We're more often than not going to find much more success with working with these plants and fungi if we're actually deeply engaged in that integration process. And so I think really that's where so much of this education comes in, especially for lawmakers, for them to understand that for many of us, and myself included, we don't necessarily want to see the only models of access to these medicines being top-down, highly regulated medical models where you're potentially, if you're prescribed this medicine and then you use it in kind of a whitewashed, sterile setting, is not really the appropriate context, at least from my perspective for this, right? So it's going to take some time. And honestly, I think that, I think you're correct in saying a lot of lawmakers aren't going to work with these medicines or try them. And I do know, just from the conversations I've had, that a lot actually have, which is really helpful, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah, it's that's why I was saying big ship, small rudder, right? We have a lot of work to do here in Colorado to educate bureaucrats and people who are making these decisions. But then more culturally, if we're looking at kind of the broader landscape and ecosystem of this work, like, the more of these personal stories that we can get in front of people that's also backed up by the science and the data, I think is the right path. And, in many cases, people are going to need to have an experience with this medicine to actually be able to effectively describe it, especially to decision makers. And that's, again, where that comes in, is like, are you, as a person advocating for this from, well, in terms of the policy reform side, like, I've worked with a lot of people in the past who've never had an experience that has changed actually recently in the last few months. And the folks that I've worked with are certainly, very well intentioned and believe in the power of these medicines from that place of looking at the science and the data, and combining personal experience and how these medicines have transformed our life for the better with that data is the way to go.
Yeah. I feel like it'll be, there will be this acknowledgement. As these service centers open up and people, therapists and practitioners who haven't had much experience working with these psychedelic plants but want to, I feel like there will just be this evolution of wanting to seek counsel from those people who have had a lot of experience just to manage things that are going to come up. So yeah, big ship, small rudder.
Oh, it's going to be an evolving process for a very long time, which is part of the beauty of it. You know, we potentially are at the outset of developing a new model of I don't want to use the term shamanism because it's been misappropriated and reappropriated all over the place, but for an engagement with these sacred plants that is unlike anything that the world has ever seen. And that's that excites me a great deal. And so I want to also be inclusive and say that I know and have experienced very deeply that there are those who have not worked with psilocybin or other psychedelics that have taught me so much about supporting people and being present, right? So it's a constant give and take, and we are all in this together. And anytime there is an exclusive mindset, and that's what I would love to see us get rid of. That's not the spirit of psychedelics. And I think it's inevitable as they become more accessible that we will see greater humility in our practice and more inclusivity.
I agree. I mean, I'm in this work in some way for the rest of my life, knowing that it's still going to be happening after I leave this, leave this plane. And to acknowledge that, it was beautifully said. I mean, to acknowledge that, people have different perspectives with these medicines, and there may be some, some give and take, and it's going to take time. And I think that's a good thing. I think rushing, now that we're here and we've, kind of planted our flag or maybe dropped a giant spore under the golden dome of our state capitol, as this, as this work myceliates across the state and the country, mushrooms take time to grow. That mycelial network spreads far and wide. And little fruiting bodies pop up, where they can. And I think that that's a good thing to be. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. That's what I learned from my time in the military. It was a phrase that they kept just honing in with us. And I think, because as if we're rushing things, and to be fair and transparent, people felt like we were rushing the process here in Colorado, with a great outcome now. But yeah, this, from zooming out perspective, not only looking at the US, but also globally, right? Like, it's important that we have these conversations and then learn to the best of our ability how to, combine how these medicines have been utilized traditionally into, a postmodern model that can really work, and is accessible to people from all walks of life. And I think that's why one thing that really excites me about Prop 122, I think, is kind of the diversity of offerings and ways to access this medicine that may be available for people.
For sure.
Definitely.
For sure. Yeah.
Could you speak more on, I believe it's called Vote Nature. Is that something that, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. Goodness. Yeah.
Just talk some more if you would. Yeah, please.
Still in fundraising mode with Vote Nature. So Vote Nature. Okay, so after Denver, about a year later, I wanted to figure out a way to make this process of policy reform more accessible to people, to get people more engaged in this democratic process. And so here's a fun fact, which blows me away, actually. In only 26 states in the US can people organize and petition together to change laws at the city or the state level, which is, weird. In the rest of the states, laws get made through state legislatures. So, the state elected officials are writing and passing bills, which is just so interesting. Like, in the quote unquote land of the free, and only in half the country can citizens actually, change laws directly by placing something on the ballot.
Wow, I was not aware of this.
Yeah. So now, to be fair, working through the state legislature is much less expensive than placing something on the ballot. And for example, I was with a friend of mine who's an attorney, and she was working in Michigan, and she was just commenting on how hard it is for citizens to put something on the ballot, right? So, there's a whole bunch of hoops for people to jump through. It's time consuming. There's weird deadlines. It was, we spent $5.5 million here in Colorado to get our measure across the finish line. Like,
Wow.
It's a lot of money for something like this, and it's necessary. Vote Nature is a platform that exists to democratize this process, to democratize psychedelic policy reform. And the way that it works is that it empowers citizens to directly contact their state lawmakers and share their personal stories of healing and transformation with these medicines.
Cool.
So you guys might be familiar, like when a bill is going through a state legislature, it's introduced, it has to go through a certain number of committees. These committees, are all filled with lawmakers. They're making amendments as the bill kind of marches along its path towards a vote on the Senate floor, let's just say. Every single time this bill goes through a committee, there's always a call to action. Show up and testify. Write a letter to your representative. Call your state senator's office. Vote Nature is a digital platform that collapses all of those calls to action into one place and makes it possible for people, essentially with the click of a button, to grab their phone. Where's the camera? Oh, this way. Say, these medicines changed my life. Please, lawmakers, support this bill. Right? Send.
Wow.
And it happens.
Oh, that's awesome.
It only works. It works because it's at scale. So lawmakers aren't getting, one or two or maybe a dozen emails a week. They're getting hundreds of emails, thousands of emails a month from their constituents saying, we want you to support this bill to decriminalize entheogens.
Oh, that's incredible. Because
lawmakers need to hear from their constituents on how to vote on things, right? And if they're not listening to their constituents, and there's something wrong there. So that's the beauty of the platform. Because it works at scale, and it can work especially now in Colorado, because we have this legislative process that's currently happening at our state capitol where they might make amendments to the measure. And it can work in all these, the dozen states that are currently considering some kind of psychedelic legislation, where if we can drive, really empower people with the tools to get re-engaged in the democratic process. And I really resonate with, imagine the beauty of making it possible for our citizens to be more involved in how our government makes decisions. And with Vote Nature as a platform, in one way, being able to unite a lot of these voices under a common cause to say yes to this kind of stuff. Or in some cases to say no to it, because it can work in the other direction too. If there's a bill that's introduced that the community doesn't necessarily agree with, then we can advocate in that other direction as well. So thank you for asking.
Awesome.
Very excited about it. Yeah, there's a
great resource. Yeah.
This
is live. This is something people can engage.
It's not live yet. It's not live yet. That's why I'm still fundraising. I haven't put a lot of energy behind the fundraising component because I've had so much other work going on, but pretty soon there is a GoFundMe. And pretty soon I'm going to start putting more, just more content, more posts, build more awareness about the possibility of this platform in the coming weeks to share more about it. And the platform's already built. It's just a matter of basically flipping the switch on, essentially.
Okay.
Because I partnered with an organization who essentially white labeled the platform, and they've been doing this for a couple of years now, and they've worked with huge companies and I think both sides of the aisle in terms of Democrats and Republicans, and it's a powerful digital advocacy tool, which can benefit and kind of yes, I said slow is smooth and smooth is fast, but any kind of support that knowing that this is happening, we're in this right now. So any kind of support that, that, I can bring to work with other folks in other states on these issues and also really galvanize a community around those bills, then I think that's a good idea.
Yeah,
sure.
I love this. I love how simple it is. I mean, I've always been intimidated by like figuring out the process of contacting our lawmakers in Kentucky. And, people are so busy and overwhelmed as it is. So anything to make things more simple is great.
And I mean, the slow is steady, and what is it? Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Yep. Is that right? I mean, I had the visual of a landslide. You think that a landslide is just that one singular movement, but it's perhaps years of little pebbles falling, before something big gives way. And you've certainly been doing the work. So talk about your consulting. You're expanding this out past Colorado, trying to help more people influence their local governments. This is something we're very interested in here in Louisville. We've been talking about Louisville decrim for a while, but don't even know how to start the process. So share with our listeners what you're doing to help, expand this out around the country.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So I also manage my one-person consulting firm. It's called Helix Consulting Group. And that's the organization that I actually use for all of my work, my contract work, my campaign work. And essentially that organization exists to just be there as a strategic advisor and support and to consult on actually, what does this policy reform process look like? How do you get started locally or at the county level or at the state level? And just to bring, all of, as I'm still learning so much about this work, but feeling really called to bring the last 5 years of my experience working in psychedelic public affairs and policy reform to support other people with this. And right now, a lot of that work with limited bandwidth is actually really still focused here in Colorado. And I think as a consulting group, and especially as Vote Nature gets online, because the two can really intersect well together, I intend to expand and just be here as a pragmatically radical voice, that has a couple of success victories on my belt to help other people find similar success with this work. And I think, for me personally, it's an opportunity to, for a long time, I've wanted to teach. And I think it's an opportunity to share these skills and teach other people how to do this work, receive a modest, energetic exchange or income from it, but really to be able to step back and sit in the joy of knowing that other people are doing this work, because we need more folks to, from my perspective, to step up and engage their lawmakers, engage their cities, et cetera, and help move this forward.
For sure.
Agreed.
I mean, sure. I wonder how much you recognize your own courage. It's something that people have said to me over the years, like, wow, you're so courageous for starting these retreats in Jamaica. And I was just like, I don't know. Like, what else am I going to do? Like, this shit saves lives. Like, of course. But, when you take the big picture look at it, and how many millions of people are working with these medicines, but because of the threat of imprisonment or social ostracization and all that goes along with it, a lot of people who would have significant influence keep quiet. So, just want to acknowledge that courage that you have had to put yourself out there, really with a family. Having kids, it's another limiting factor for a lot of people. And it communicates the value and importance that these plants can bring to families and helping build stronger, healthier families rather than the opposite. Personally, I think that it should be the United States government that is correcting the miseducation that was perpetrated through the drug war, but they're not going to. So, folks like ourselves have to step up.
And thank you. those early days with Denver were certainly a little nerve-wracking, right?
Mhm.
Like being very, very as quiet as we could possibly be, especially in the early stages where we were drafting the various iterations of that, that local measure. And I feel so grateful and blessed that for some reason Spirit chose me to do some of this work and to be a voice for this cause. And I think, as I was saying, the next step is to inspire that same kind of courage in other people to do this work. And thankfully there are, as you said, millions of people. Okay, so that reminds me, this is just an interesting kind of factoid for the listeners. This work, it's a populist movement that I think is gaining more recognition, but not well known right now. And the reason why I say that, in addition to, success at the ballot box we've seen in the last couple of years, 17 cities, state bills and resolutions, et cetera, happening this year. There's a couple of surveys that were done. One that was 2 years ago, where 35% of American voters believe that psychedelics like psilocybin have a medical benefit. And then there was another study or another survey that was done last year that concluded that 65% of Americans with some kind of mental or behavioral health challenge want access to psychedelics. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of voters, right? And thankfully, I think we're seeing some movement at the federal level. There's 2 bills. I'm not as up to speed on them as I'd like to be, but there's 2 bills I think currently being considered, bipartisan bills being considered in Congress. And gosh, there are so many voices out there. And I think that this demographic of individuals in the US who really believe in the power of these medicines to change people's lives, that we can actually be a political voice for change, especially if we're considering how the use of these medicines intersects with so many other things, right? If we're talking about the ecology or food systems and religion and spirituality, right? So there's something happening here. And I think it has a ton of potential. And
100%.
Yeah, it's just so exciting to watch and be a part of it.
So you've talked about, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to hog this, Courtney. Things are coming to mind. We're kind of coming close to our end here.
We are.
Yeah,
It's great. It's perfect.
I know Kevin and I, we went on for about 90 minutes on the call, and I think we just had all right, we could just talk for 2 more hours. If we want to.
That's awesome.
So, but my question, you mentioned you've used the term spirit at least twice in this conversation, and I'd love it if you could share, what does spirituality, mysticism, what does that mean to you, and what role does the mushroom play in that relationship?
Thank you for asking that question. I've always engaged in this process from a spiritual perspective. In the introduction, as I was sharing about my circumstances around depression, and then eventually working with psilocybin mushrooms, there's as I'm listening to that voice inside me right now, learning how to more embody that divine spark that exists in everyone. Learning how to better listen to that voice, and then to take action and create more change in my life from that guidance that comes from somewhere else. The work of policy reform has been very heady for me. It's a very heady process. And I mean, just the talking about this right now, it's bringing up a lot for me because I've been, especially after the campaign ended, I kind of zoomed back at my own experience from the past couple of years and realized that I haven't had as much of a grounded practice as I would like. As I mentioned, it's been a very kind of cerebral experience for me, especially from that spiritual perspective, like more knowledge, right? And knowledge is great, but understanding is embodied. You know, we can have as much information as possible, but if we're not using that information in a way that's directing the course of our life on a daily process, then there's no understanding there, or maybe understanding is a better word. And I would like to start talking more about spirituality in the context of plant medicines, because it's something that's not really discussed a lot. There's and this kind of goes along with what I was saying. There's three things that we don't talk about in policy reform or politics: sex, death, and religion. And so, which happen to be three
fundamentals of life.
Right. And exactly. And like there's a lot of intersection with sex, death, and religion with psychedelics, right?
It's kind of all we talk about on this show.
Yeah. On the Psilocybin Says.
We just interviewed a death doula last week. So anyway.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, we're about to launch a death doula training through Sanctuary for psychedelic ministers to. Anyway, sorry, I'll get off on that.
Man, please. No, that's tremendous to hear. And so how do we, like knowing how the mystical experience is grounded so much in how folks have expressed their what they got from working with these medicines, right? Like people say it's like either the most spiritual or mystical experience they've ever had in their entire life, or like it's in their top 5, right? And so how do we bring that back into this conversation? Because I think that it's really important that if we're talking about using these medicines for healing, what happens when we heal is you all have seen this. When we heal and that tension and that stress and anxiety and trauma is released, it opens up so much bandwidth for creative potential. And we are creators here on this planet, and we deserve to remember that and have the tools to be able to embody that knowing and understanding so that we can make an impact in the world in a way that can benefit as many people as possible. And so that's, as I'm circling back and kind of zooming out from this work, from doing this work, one of the next stages for me is to really start to deeply embody the work. Because I'm not perfect. I'm human, right? Like perfect would be boring if there wasn't the yin and the yang and it was all light. That'd be like, where's the messiness? I want some messy in here, So
yeah,
it's and I'm listening to myself because we know that these experiences can be ineffable, right? Or very hard to describe. And I just know that engaging with this question and feeling the excitement arise within me is that's that inspiration, that's that spirit that's coming through. And I'm learning how to open my voice more in that regard, and get back to that place where kind of pre-policy reform, integrating all of that work and including it and now transcending it as well. Because it's time. It's time.
Yeah. I mean, you brought up several times in this conversation, community, and using these medicines, these sacred plants in community is so powerful. And what is community if we don't have these conversations about what's next? And as we have loved ones transition into what's next from this life, it's kind of, we have to have these conversations around spirit and what that means to all of us. So yeah, I feel like it is kind of like the next thing to talk about with psychedelics as we start really focusing on community and reconnecting with each other.
And that's
again
in large part what happened with Courtney and I. In Jamaica, it was this very therapy oriented wellness retreat. People heard about psilocybin through Michael Pollan and CNN, and so they came with kind of a preconceived idea of what it was about. And it's always been a spirit. From my very first mushroom experience, this was a spiritual experience. I learned things about myself that only whatever consciousness, God, however you want to term it, could teach me. And it became really more important. The more enmeshed we became in the world of wellness, the more important it became for us to get back to that world of spirit. Because that's where it was all founded. And I do believe, not like, who knows what we'll see in terms of what organizations look like as time goes on. But, we talked with a medical doctor a year or so ago here on the podcast, and she was saying how she thought psychedelics would be what brought spirituality back into medical practice. And I think there's a lot of potential there. And I do hope so. We've been divorced from this ineffable aspect of ourselves for far too long. And the current religions that we've been practicing in the United States, while they have value, there's not a lot of direct experience with this mystical, which is what we all there is no substitute for experience, as Einstein himself said. And so seeing that become more and more a part of our cultural embodiment, if you will, of healing seems like it's only natural.
Yeah. I'm reminded of, for me personally, when, it's until a few days ago, it had been 2 years since I sat with the medicine. And the reminder is that this medicine exists within us already. Right. And sometimes we are medicine carriers already, we have androgenous DMT. If we do a good breathwork practice, we can certainly release some of that into our physiology, right? Like some Wim Hof method in the morning in a cold shower might do it for some people. It does for me. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about working with these medicines as well. And especially the mushrooms, and grandmother ayahuasca, it's that reminder. It's this is already a part of you. And sometimes we need to awaken that by, directly working at the source of it, to remind us that we're already always connected to the source of it. We just sometimes need that little nudge. And so it'll be interesting to see how as this ecosystem evolves and matures over the next decades, right? How this work has a much more transformative impact on, kind of all these different sectors of the human experience, knowing that all of it is, at least from what I believe, emanating from spirit and trickling down into the third dimension, manifest reality.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. That's what I keep saying is the psychological benefits of psychedelics are secondary. It's your spirit is healing, and therefore you experience it in your psyche, in your body, in your relationships. So well said. But we're gonna have to hop. I know we can keep on going. I'll just keep on talking. There's so much.
Keep going.
I've got 5 questions that I want to ask you, but I'm we got to get moving.
Well, cool. So this is the perfect time for the final question, and something that we ask all of our guests. So, Kevin, what does psilocybin say to you?
Subtlety. Subtlety is where the deepest work can happen. And that's been, I think, my biggest lesson with this, because the temptation is to be kind of out and proud about this work, right? And if I'm being honest with myself and true to the work, then I'm really digging deeply into the unseen, the unheard, the unknown, constantly stepping into those spaces that are very subtle and need refining to gain more clarity and understanding.
I love that. That's a wonderful reminder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you sound like someone who just had a mushroom trip.
I made
Kevin, it's been such a pleasure, and I hope that we will be able to have you again on our show in the future to keep sharing your good work. And we'll also share all of your links and everything in our show notes. And
amazing.
Just really look forward to, hopefully continuing the relationship.
Yeah, same. Thanks for everything you've done and are continuing to do.
You're welcome. Yeah, you're so welcome. And Courtney and Eric, it's been a fun talk. I look forward to seeing you both in person, hopefully in the near future, and continuing this conversation.